The heavy oak doors of the chapel stood before me like the gates to a battlefield, and as they creaked open, the golden and red light from the stained glass windows cut across the aisle in sharp streaks. I was 32 years old, Julia Dawson, and this was supposed to be the most sacred day of my life, the day I walked with pride into a future I had fought to build with my own hands. Yet as the organ swelled and the guests turned to look, my heart did not race because of nerves or joy. It raced because I heard the familiar whisper of cruelty riding the air from the front pew. My sister Victoria, elegant in her designer dress, leaned toward the guests beside her and said with deliberate scorn, "Look at her trying to play soldier on her wedding day. Pathetic." The words were quiet but sharp enough to slice through the music, and I felt the sting in my chest as if I were 17 again, standing in my father's living room with the echo of his hand still burning across my face. My jaw tightened, my eyes fixed forward, but inside a storm rose. She was mocking not just the uniform pressed to perfection against my skin, but the years of sacrifice stitched into every thread. She wanted me to crumble in front of the 100 faces gathered to make my life's choice look absurd. This was her way of reminding me that in the Dawson family, she had always been the chosen one, and I, the outcast. Yet I kept walking. Step by steady step, my heels struck the stone floor, each sound carrying the weight of battles fought and scars buried deep. The smirk curving her lips was the same one she had worn at countless dinners when my father dismissed my medals as trinkets, and my mother looked away, pretending not to hear. It was a smirk that said she had already won. The chapel was filled with civilians in tailored suits and dresses, their jewelry sparkling under the light, and mixed among them were rows of crisp uniforms worn by my brothers and sisters in service. The air felt charged with the clash of two worlds, one of hollow status and one of earned respect. I could feel eyes darting between me and Victoria, some curious, some judgmental, as if waiting to see whether I would falter under her sneer. Every step closer to the altar brought back a flood of memories. Christmas dinners where my words disappeared under her stories. Birthdays where my father raised a glass to her promotions and ignored mine. Even the night before this ceremony when my phone lit up with a message from my father that read, "Do not embarrass us by wearing that costume." My sister's laughter was still echoing in my head when she called to say, "Can you not just be normal for one day, Julia?" They had set the stage for me to fail, and Victoria's whisper was the opening act. I inhaled slowly, the scent of wax candles mixing with the faint polish of marble floors. I reminded myself that I was not the invisible daughter they thought I was. I was a decorated officer, a commander trusted with lives. I had carried the burden of decision when seconds meant survival, when hesitation meant death. This wedding was not just a union with the man I loved. It was the moment where my two worlds would finally collide and I would no longer hide one to appease the other. The organ's swell grew louder, almost drowning out the venom of her words. I caught sight of my mother Margaret clutching her pearls and pretending not to notice the insult. My father sat rigid, eyes narrowed, as if every inch of my uniform was an attack on him personally. They were united in their silence and disdain the same way they had always been. But what they did not know, what even Victoria in her arrogance could not see, was that the chapel they sat in was about to transform into something far greater than a family showcase. It was about to become a demonstration of power and respect they could not laugh away. I tightened my grip on the bouquet, the white petals trembling slightly with the force of my hand. My gaze locked on the altar where Ryan, steady and certain, waited for me. Yet even his presence was not enough to drown out the fire burning inside. I whispered inwardly to myself, "Today everything changes. They will mock, they will sneer, but before this ceremony is done, they will be forced to see me as I am. The uniform they call a costume will speak louder than any of them ever could, and when the truth unfolds, they will remember this day not as the day Julia humiliated herself, but as the day Julia Dawson rewrote the definition of respect. In 1997, I was 7 years old and already learning that love in the Dawson household was never unconditional. My father, Richard, then 45, sat at the head of the table every evening like a king surveying his court, his voice booming when he praised my sister Victoria. She was 10 at the time, a golden child in his eyes, graceful and obedient, the embodiment of everything he thought a daughter should be. He would pat her head after piano practice and say, "That's my girl destined for great things," while turning to me with a sigh of disappointment. Too stubborn. Julia too boyish, always arguing, he would mutter loud enough for me to hear. Those words sank into me like stones, shaping how I saw myself before I even understood who I was. By the year 22, I was 12, and the pattern had only deepened. Victoria, at 15, was given a new piano, a sleek, polished instrument delivered with fanfare, while I was handed a stack of second-hand books and told to be grateful. I remember pressing the keys when she was not around, feeling the smooth ivory beneath my fingers, only to have her shove me away and say, "This is mine, stay in your place." My father never corrected her. My mother, Margaret, floated in and out of these scenes, smoothing wrinkles without ever tearing the fabric of injustice. She would say, "He doesn't mean it. Julia or your father just wants what's best," her gentle voice turning poison into sugar but leaving the wound intact. I learned early that silence was the safest shield, though it never dulled the sting. In 2007, when I was 17, everything came to a head. I stood in the living room, courage trembling in my chest, and announced that I intended to enlist in the Navy after graduation. Richard's face turned crimson. "No daughter of mine will play soldier," he thundered, and before I could flinch, his hand struck my cheek so hard, the room spun. The sound echoed against the walls, and I stumbled back with tears burning my eyes. Victoria smirked from the couch, victorious without lifting a finger. My mother's only response was a hushed plea. "Don't provoke him. Julia, please just let it go." That moment seared itself into me, not only the pain of the blow, but the weight of realizing that my family would never stand behind me. They wanted a daughter molded in their image, a woman who would smile, marry well, and never defy the order of things. Victoria slipped easily into that role, radiant under their praise, while I was cast as the rebel, the disappointment, the girl who never knew her place. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, my cheek still throbbing, and swore silently that if I could not find respect within those walls, I would carve it out in the world beyond them. That vow became the fire that carried me forward. I began to understand that the Dawson family hierarchy was a fortress I would never breach no matter how many achievements I stacked at its gates. To them, Victoria would always be the heir and I, the unwanted second. The imbalance twisted every holiday, every dinner, every conversation, until even laughter felt like a performance staged around her. I grew into adulthood knowing that at home I was invisible, but I also knew that somewhere outside those walls I could become something different. That realization was not a gentle one. It was forged in humiliation bruises and the slow erosion of faith in people who were supposed to love me most. And yet, it also planted a steel resolve inside me, the knowledge that one day I would make them see me not as the unwanted child, but as a force they could no longer deny. By 2010, I was 20 years old and had just completed one of the most grueling training cycles the Navy had to offer. My body was hardened, my spirit sharpened, yet the moment I walked back into my parents' home in Norfolk, I felt 17 again, small and unwanted. My father, Richard, looked me up and down in the living room, his gaze heavy with disdain. "Wasting your life," he said flatly, as if the months of sleepless nights, drills, and sacrifices meant nothing more than a childish rebellion. My mother, Margaret, stood nearby with her familiar expression of helpless calm and murmured, "He does not understand. Julia, do not take it to heart." It was the same line she had used all my life. The same gentle dismissal that never addressed the cruelty at its root. I clenched my fists, but swallowed the words I wanted to hurl. Confrontation only fed his temper. I had learned that long ago. In 2015, I was 25 and returned from deployment carrying my first official medal. I held it carefully, almost timidly, thinking, maybe, just maybe, he would see it and feel pride. Richard barely glanced at it before muttering, "Another trinket." My sister Victoria laughed out loud, tossing her hair back. "Nobody cares about medals, Julia," she sneered. "You could have been at home building a real life instead of playing soldier." My mother shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The dismissal hit harder than bullets ever had, reducing my sacrifice to a joke. That night, I sat in my childhood room, the metal resting on my palm, and felt the same ache I had felt at 12 when Victoria received the piano and I was handed used books. Nothing I achieved would ever pierce their armor of contempt. In 2017, at 27, the tension finally spilled over. I had returned from another tour overseas carrying scars inside and out. At dinner, my father began lecturing about how Victoria's career in finance was what real success looked like. I pushed back, my voice shaking, telling him that saving lives in combat zones mattered too. His face turned red, and before I could react, he shoved me backward, his strength fueled by fury. I fell against the edge of the coffee table, pain slicing across my arm and leaving a scar that I still carry. As I lay there gasping, he towered above me and spat, "You will never learn." My mother rushed to my side, but instead of anger at him, her words fell like another blow. "You should not talk back, Julia. Why do you always provoke him? Gaslighting at its cruelest, turning his violence into my fault." Victoria stood in the doorway, watching with arms folded, her lips curved in that familiar smirk. It was as if the hierarchy of our family was carved in stone, and every act of cruelty was just a way of chiseling it deeper. That scar became more than a physical mark. It was proof that my own home was a battlefield where I fought not enemies, but the people whose approval I once craved. The more they dismissed me, the more determined I became, yet the damage was real. Nights in barracks overseas often felt safer than nights at the Dawson dinner table. I learned to stop hoping for validation from them. Every cruel word, every shove, every laugh at my expense hardened me into someone who could no longer be broken by their judgment. Yet I also carried the deep ache of invisibility, the sorrow of knowing that nothing I accomplished would ever open their eyes. They had decided long ago who Julia Dawson was meant to be, and nothing could rewrite that story inside their minds. Still, I pressed forward. If they would not see me, the world would. By 2018, I was 28 years old and standing in a command center half a world away from Virginia, my headset pressed tight against my ear as static filled the room and the lives of 12 hostages hung in the balance. Screens flickered with grainy images from drones circling above a compound in the desert, and every set of eyes in that room turned toward me. Hardened men with decades of combat experience held their breath waiting for my order. My pulse hammered, but my voice came steady. "Execute Alpha. Send the sitrep when you are clear." The commander on the ground acknowledged, and the room erupted in motion, the team breaching the compound shots echoing faintly through the feed. Minutes later, the call came through, "Hostages secure." The air shifted, shoulders relaxed. Someone muttered Roger that Valkyrie and the name spread like fire through the room. Valkyrie, the shield and the sword, the woman who led them through danger without flinching. It was not a nickname given lightly. It was a recognition that my judgment, my steadiness under fire, had saved lives. In that moment, I felt the weight of every insult and dismissal from my family, and I realized that outside the Dawson household, my worth was not invisible. It was carved into the respect of warriors who did not care about family politics or appearances. They cared about competence, and I had proven mine beyond doubt. Over the next years, I carried that name into every mission, each time reinforcing that respect. My uniform was not a costume as my father claimed, but a testament. The ribbons on my chest were not trinkets as he mocked, but markers of decisions that had altered the course of lives. My superiors trusted me, my peers followed me, and the people under my command knew that when Julia Dawson spoke, it was with the weight of conviction and experience. Yet when I returned home, the contrast was brutal. Victoria still ruled every dinner her tales of financial deals and new properties, drawing nods from my parents, while my stories of missions dissolved into silence. My father would ask about her portfolio with gleaming pride, then glance at me with weary disdain. "Another deployment, Julia. When will you settle down?" My mother would smile thinly and say, "He just wants to see you happy," which meant happy on his terms, never mine. The dissonance was sharp, almost unbearable. Out there, I was Valkyrie, an officer whose voice could command men into battle. In here, I was still the unwanted daughter, the stubborn child who never measured up. I learned to hold both realities in my hands without letting one crush the other. The recognition I earned on the battlefield was real, and it was enough to carry me through their contempt. Still, the ache lingered. I wanted, even against my better judgment, for them to look at me once and say, "We are proud," but I knew by now that day would never come. Respect from them was a locked door, and I no longer wasted energy trying to break it down. I turned instead toward building my own world where loyalty and trust mattered more than blood. In 2021, when I was 31 years old, I met Ryan Carter at a joint Navy briefing in Washington. He was 33, calm-eyed, and steady-voiced, a man who carried his own scars but never let them harden into cruelty. We worked side by side for months, trading reports, late-night strategy calls, and finally quiet conversations that shifted from missions to dreams. By the spring of 2022, he asked me to marry him, his hand firm around mine, his eyes steady. For the first time in my life, I felt the possibility of a future built on respect, not demand. When the news reached my family, the reaction was a storm. My father sent a message to my phone, the words cold and sharp. "Do not embarrass us by wearing that costume." To him, my uniform was still a childish act, a rebellion he could not forgive. My sister Victoria called days later, her voice dripping with contempt. "At least wear a dress like a woman, Julia. Do you want everyone to laugh at you?" My mother tried her familiar soft defense, saying, "He only wants you to look beautiful," but I could hear the hollow echo behind her words. They wanted to erase the very part of me that defined my life. I sat in my apartment with Ryan and unfolded the plan that had been simmering in me for years. This wedding would not be a stage for their ridicule. It would be my demonstration. We decided on a full military ceremony at a historic chapel in Virginia. The fleet admiral himself agreed to officiate a gesture that carried enormous weight. Invitations went out not only to family, but to my comrades' officers and the very men who had stood beside me in deserts and oceans. The ushers would seat them in the front rows as protocol demanded their uniforms a wall of quiet authority. Ryan supported every detail without hesitation. He knew what this meant to me, that it was more than vows and rings. It was a chance to stand openly in both worlds and not bow my head. As the date approached, I could feel the old dread creeping in the memory of dinners where my words dissolved under Victoria's. Yet with every dress fitting and every rehearsal, with every salute exchanged in practice by my honor guard, I felt steadier. On the night before the wedding, I laid out my uniform on the chair, its white fabric gleaming in the low light. I remembered the scar on my arm, the medals dismissed as trinkets, the laughter that followed every attempt to be seen. I tightened my jaw and whispered to myself, "They will see me." Not because I explain or beg, but because the truth will stand in front of them, undeniable. Ryan touched my shoulder, then telling me, "You do not have to prove anything." But he also knew that for me, this was not about their approval. It was about my liberation. Tomorrow, the world I had built and the family that tried to deny me would finally collide. I was ready. On October 15th of 2022, the morning air in Virginia carried the crisp edge of autumn, and the chapel stood adorned with flowers and banners, its stone walls echoing with the swell of the organ. Guests filed in, some in gleaming uniforms pressed to perfection, others in civilian attire with polished shoes and tailored suits. The contrast was stark. Two worlds gathered under one roof, one bound by sacrifice and duty, the other by bloodlines and appearances. As I waited outside the heavy doors, my breath came steady, though my hands gripped the bouquet tight. The honor guard had already taken their places, each movement executed with military precision. Inside, I could hear the shifting of seats, the whispers of anticipation, and beneath it all, the faint hiss of contempt I had known all my life. When the doors opened and I stepped forward, sunlight from the stained glass spilled across the aisle. The first rows were filled with officers and comrades, their shoulders squared, their eyes forward, their presence a wall of silent strength. Beyond them, my relatives sat dressed in finery jewels, catching the light expressions mixed with curiosity and judgment. My father Richard sat rigid, his jaw tight, his gaze sharp as if each inch of my uniform offended him personally. My mother Margaret kept her eyes low, clutching her pearls, her silence as loud as any condemnation. But it was my sister Victoria who struck hardest. She leaned toward a cousin and whispered just loud enough to carry, "She looks ridiculous. Like a clown in white." A ripple of muffled laughter followed from a few relatives, and I felt the familiar sting in my chest. The organ music swelled, yet their contempt cut through like a knife. I forced my gaze forward, my steps measured each heel striking stone like the steady beat of defiance. I could feel eyes on me, some filled with respect, others with ridicule, as if the ceremony itself had become a contest between two narratives. My heart ached, but I held my head high. Victoria's voice rose again, dripping with scorn. "Can you imagine the photos? She will look like she wandered out of a parade." Her laughter joined with another relative's chuckle, and I felt the old wound reopen, the same wound carved at 17, when my father struck me for daring to dream of service. My hands tightened around the bouquet until the petals trembled. A flicker of doubt tried to creep in, whispering that maybe they were right, that maybe I looked absurd. But then my eyes met the steady gaze of the officers lining the aisle, their presence unyielding. I remembered the desert, the radio static the moment lives hung on my command. That was real. This mockery was hollow. Yet the cruelty of my family did its work, pulling me downward, forcing me to fight tears. The chapel seemed to tilt under the weight of their judgment. I caught sight of Victoria smirking, her chin lifted in triumph, as if this spectacle confirmed everything she believed. She thought she had already won, that I was nothing more than the stubborn child she had always overshadowed. My father leaned toward her, then his lips curling into a cruel smile, and muttered, "Embarrassing." My mother touched his arm, not to stop him, but to calm the surface, as she always did. They believed the stage belonged to them, that their whispers and sneers could define me even here. I inhaled slowly, steadying myself, reminding my heart that the moment was not yet finished. The twist had not yet come. "Hold steady," I told myself. "The time will arrive." Each step felt heavier than the last as I neared the altar. The organ thundered, and yet the sound of mockery clung to the air like smoke. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake in barracks missing home, but knowing that home was never truly mine. I thought of the men and women who had looked to me for orders and survived because I did not falter. Their respect was not hollow, it was earned. That respect was here now, embodied in the rows of uniforms waiting to stand at my side. I clung to that truth as the whispers continued. "She looks like she is pretending. She will never belong." The words echoed, each one trying to drag me back into the shadows of my childhood. But I kept walking, my back straight, my eyes fixed on Ryan waiting at the altar. My pulse pounded, but my steps did not falter. The moment of reckoning was close, and I knew that soon the laughter would die. As I reached the midpoint of the aisle, the weight of every whispered insult pressed against my chest, threatening to crush the steadiness I had fought so hard to maintain. The organ reverberated off the stone walls, but louder still was the sound of Victoria's laughter trickling like poison through the pews. My father shifted in his seat, smug and certain that this was his victory the day his stubborn younger daughter would be reduced to a spectacle. My mother sat stiff, her fingers twisting the pearls at her neck, her silence echoing like a judgment she would never voice. My breath came slow and measured, my grip on the bouquet unyielding. Then it happened. From the side of the chapel, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding, the kind of voice that slices through noise and carves authority into the air. "Admiral on deck!" The words cracked against the walls, and in that instant, the entire room shifted. 150 officers and sailors rose to their feet in unison, the sound of their boots thundering against the stone hands, snapping into crisp salutes. The movement was a wave rolling through the chapel with the force of a storm. Civilians gasped their whispers, silenced their eyes wide with shock as the solemnity of military tradition filled the sacred space. For a moment, the world froze. I continued walking the salute, holding steady in my peripheral vision, and for the first time since I had entered the chapel, I felt the weight of power shift. This was not their stage anymore. This was mine. Victoria's smirk faltered, her face paling as the reality of what was unfolding sank in. She glanced around at the sea of uniforms, her confidence faltering like a flame in wind. My father's smug expression cracked into disbelief, his mouth tightening into a thin line, his hands gripping the edge of the pew. My mother's eyes widened, her hand covering her lips as if to stifle a gasp. Yet still, the silence of my family screamed louder than words. I stepped forward, every movement deliberate, the 4 stars on my shoulders gleaming under the light. They had dismissed me as a girl playing soldier, but now they saw what that uniform meant. It was not a costume. It was command authority, sacrifice, and respect. Still, even as the awe settled across the room, Victoria tried one last jab, her voice rising with desperation. "This is absurd. She looks like she wandered into a play." A few nervous chuckles flitted through the civilian side, but they died quickly as the rows of uniforms held firm, their salutes unbroken, their eyes locked on me with reverence. And then the final twist came. From the front row where he had sat beside Victoria with his hand resting on his knee, Mark Evans suddenly rose. His tall frame cut through the uncertainty, and as the chapel watched, he stepped into the aisle. For a breath, the room hushed, every gaze fixed on him. Then he dropped to one knee, his head bowed, and his voice rang clear. "Hello, General." The title struck like a bell reverberating through stone and heart alike. Gasps erupted. Murmurs shot through the pews. Victoria's face drained of color, her eyes widening with disbelief. My father's mouth fell open, his certainty unraveling in an instant. My mother's shoulders slumped, her pearls slipping loose in her trembling fingers. And I stood there frozen not with fear, but with the sudden recognition of what this moment meant. Mark Evans, my brother-in-law, had once been under my command. In 2018, in the chaos of a desert night, I had given the order that saved his life. I remembered the gunfire, the static of the radio, his voice breaking through the noise with gratitude when the mission ended. I had not spoken of it at home because I knew they would not care. Yet, here, in front of everyone, he brought it to light. The kneeling man was not just my sister's husband. He was living proof that my uniform was more than fabric, that my command was more than stubborn defiance. He spoke for every soldier I had led, every life I had carried, every scar I bore. His words shattered the last defense of their mockery. "Hello, General." 2 words that rewrote the air. The chapel held its breath, suspended in awe. The officers' salutes seemed to grow sharper. The civilians sat transfixed, the divide between mockery and truth collapsing under the weight of reality. Victoria reached for Mark's arm, her voice trembling. "Get up! What are you doing?" But he pulled away, his eyes steady on me. "Maybe you should start respecting your sister," he said firmly, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. My father slumped back into his seat, stripped of the authority he had wielded for decades. My mother looked down, unable to meet my gaze. And Victoria, once so proud and certain, sat rigid, her lips parted in shock, her smirk extinguished. I took the final steps to the altar with my heart pounding not from fear, but from triumph. This was the moment I had waited for, the culmination of years of silence and dismissal. The truth was no longer hidden in distant deserts or quiet reports. It stood here in the open, undeniable, unshakable, saluted and spoken into existence by those who knew its weight. The girl who had been slapped at 17, who had been mocked at every holiday dinner, who had been told her medals were trinkets, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had commanded lives and earned respect that no sneer could erase. The chapel itself seemed transformed, no longer a stage for ridicule, but a sanctuary of recognition. And as Ryan's eyes met mine at the altar, steady and proud, I felt the strength of every soldier behind me, every salute a promise that I would never again walk alone into mockery. The silence after Mark's words hung heavy in the chapel, like a storm cloud refusing to move. Victoria sat frozen, her face drained of color, her hand still hovering in the air where she had tried to tug at her husband's arm. The confident smirk that had been her weapon for decades was gone, replaced by wide eyes and a tight jaw that betrayed her fear. My father. Richard gripped the edge of the pew as if the wood itself might anchor him, his knuckles white, his expression twisting from disbelief to rage and then to something weaker, something hollow. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as a towering figure of control, but as a man stripped of his illusions. My mother, Margaret, pressed a trembling hand to her lips, pearls slipping against her fingers, her silence no longer protective but suffocating. The guests sat stunned. Some civilians shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking away from my family as though their shame might be contagious. The officers remained steadfast salutes held until the final note of the organ faded their loyalty undimmed. Victoria whispered again, this time her voice cracked and uneven. This isn't real, this isn't happening. But it was happening, and the truth could not be pushed aside. Mark stood slowly, his eyes not on her, but fixed firmly on me. His words had been deliberate, not just an acknowledgement of the past, but a rebuke of every insult hurled at me across decades. Maybe you should start respecting your sister, he had said, and it was a sentence that reshaped the air. My father attempted to rise, his voice rasping with anger. Enough of this spectacle. But before he could take a step, the fleet admiral who officiated the ceremony turned his head and leveled him with a gaze that carried the weight of oceans. Richard faltered and sank back down, his authority broken by a single look. My mother leaned close to him, whispering desperately, but I caught the fear in her eyes. The hierarchy of our family had collapsed in front of everyone, and no polite words could repair it. And the reception that followed the divide became undeniable. Officers, senators, and comrades surrounded me and Ryan, their voices warm with congratulations, their respect tangible. They asked about missions, about leadership, about the courage it took to make decisions under fire. Laughter and camaraderie filled the hall. Across the room, my family huddled in a corner, isolated. No one approached them, not out of cruelty, but because they no longer belonged in this circle. Their tailored suits and polished smiles looked cheap in the glow of uniforms and medals. Richard's booming presence was gone, replaced by a hunched silence. Margaret's attempts at small talk fell flat, her words ignored. Victoria stood stiff, her eyes darting nervously toward Mark, who refused to meet her gaze. The very man she thought would strengthen her place had instead exposed her weakness. She had mocked my uniform as a costume, but now the man she married had knelt before it. That humiliation burned in her eyes, and I knew she would never recover from it. As the night wore on, they slipped quietly toward the side exit. No goodbyes, no congratulations, no words to fill the void. Their departure was not a loss, it was a release. For years they had controlled the narrative, painted me as the disappointment, the stubborn child, the soldier playing dress-up. But in one ceremony, the truth had undone them. Their authority dissolved their voices, muted their legacy hollow. The consequences were clear and sharp. Victoria was left with a husband who had chosen respect for me over loyalty to her cruelty. Richard's pride was shattered, his reputation in the community stained by his inability to recognize what others now celebrated openly. Margaret's silence was no longer seen as peacekeeping, but as complicity, a truth she could no longer hide behind. And I, for the first time, stood free. The family who had dismissed me could no longer touch me, their power gone, their influence broken. Respect had spoken louder than blood, and it had left them exposed. When the reception hall filled with the soft glow of chandeliers and the murmur of conversation, I felt the shift deep inside me. For the first time in my life, I was not walking into a room where my presence would be diminished. Every handshake, every nod of respect, every toast that rang out was directed at me and Ryan, not at the people who had once claimed to be the center of my world. Officers clapped me on the shoulder. Senators offered words of admiration, and comrades who had bled beside me spoke with pride. The room pulsed with warmth and belonging. Across the way, I saw my family, the Dawsons clustered like ghosts in a corner, their expressions stiff and pale. They looked out of place, their expensive suits and dresses stripped of their power in a hall alive with uniforms and medals. People passed by them without a second glance. No one asked Richard about his business connections. No one asked Victoria about her financial successes. No one sought Margaret's polite conversation. They were irrelevant here, and they knew it. I watched as Victoria tried to catch Mark's eye. Her words sharp and desperate, but he turned from her, his face set with quiet anger. That moment between them was louder than any argument. He had made his choice, and it was not her arrogance he respected. My father sat hunched, staring at his drink as though it might provide an escape. My mother stood beside him, her hand resting nervously on his arm, but she too seemed diminished, her smile brittle, her pearls dull in the golden light. I realized then that they were experiencing what I had endured for decades in visibility. But unlike me, they had earned it through cruelty, and now the world no longer cared for their voices. As the evening unfolded, Ryan raised a toast, his voice steady and filled with pride. To Julia, he said, "The bravest woman I know, the leader we all follow, and the partner I am honored to stand beside." Glasses clinked, cheers echoed, and I felt tears sting my eyes. Not the tears of hurt I had hidden for years, but the tears of being truly seen. My family slipped away sometime after their exit, quiet, their footsteps hurried. No words of blessing, no acknowledgement of the vows spoken, no attempt to mend what had been broken. They vanished into the night like shadows, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of their disdain. Yet for me, there was no ache in their absence. Instead, there was a lightness, a release I had never imagined possible. For so long, I had carried the weight of their contempt, bending under the pressure of trying to prove myself. But now, the truth had spoken not through my pleas, but through the undeniable respect of others. I did not follow them. I did not look back. My life no longer revolved around the orbit of their approval. As I stood surrounded by comrades and new family, I understood that the circle I needed was already here. The consequences for them would ripple beyond this night. Richard would return to his community without the authority he once wielded. Whispers of his daughter the Admiral celebrated and saluted would overshadow the image he had tried to craft. Margaret would wrestle with the knowledge that her silence had built this fracture, her attempts to smooth over cruelty now seen as cowardice. Victoria would face the unraveling of her marriage, her husband's loyalty no longer unquestioned, but those consequences were theirs to carry. Mine was freedom. That night, as Ryan and I slipped away into the quiet of our new life together, I looked up at the stars and thought of the girl I had once been, the girl who longed for her father's pride and her sister's kindness. I whispered to her that we had survived, that we had built something stronger, that we were finally free. By 2027, 5 years had passed since that day in the chapel when the tide of my life finally turned, and I often found myself standing at the window of my office overlooking Washington with a clarity I had never known as a child. At 37, I wore new stars on my shoulders, not because of luck or inheritance, but because every step of my career had been carved out through grit, sacrifice, and the quiet resolve to prove that I could never again be silenced. The city spread out beneath me, a reminder that I had once been dismissed as stubborn and boyish, told I would never belong, and yet here I was, guiding policy and leading missions that shaped the future of the Navy. At home, my life was steadier than I ever dreamed. Ryan and I had built a partnership rooted in mutual respect, where love was measured not by conditions or approval, but by shared burdens and the unspoken understanding of two people forged in the same fire. Our home was filled not with whispered mockery, but with laughter, quiet dinners, and plans for the future. We did not need to explain ourselves to each other because we both knew the cost of service and the value of loyalty. My family, the Dawsons, had long since faded from the center of my world. Richard was older now, his health failing, his once booming voice reduced to a tired rasp. He had no audience left, no authority to wield. The community that once nodded at his stories now spoke only of the daughter he had tried to diminish. He lived surrounded by silence, the same silence he had given me for decades. Margaret visited occasionally, but our conversations were shallow, her attempts to bridge the distance always crumbling under the weight of her years of complicity. She would say, "I just wanted peace." Julia and I would answer quietly, "Peace built on silence is not peace at all." Victoria's life had unraveled further. Her marriage to Mark collapsed within 2 years of my wedding. His respect for me had been the final wedge, but it was her own cruelty that drove him away. She tried to hold on to the image of superiority, but it slipped from her grasp, leaving her alone and bitter. The hierarchy that had once placed her above me no longer existed. In its place was a hollow space she could not fill. Yet I did not rejoice in their downfall. Consequences are not victories to be savored, they are truths to be acknowledged. Their lives reflected the choices they had made, just as mine reflected mine. The lesson was simple but sharp. Family by blood can betray, but family by respect endures. Over the years, I built a new circle. Comrades who had once stood beside me in deserts now came to my home with their families. Young officers sought my counsel, trusting not only my rank but my integrity. Together, we created bonds that were thicker than blood, built not on obligation but on choice. Legacy, I realized, is not what someone hands to you. It is what you fight for, what you sacrifice for, and what you earn when others stand and recognize your worth. One evening, as Ryan and I walked through the park near our home, a group of young cadets saluted as we passed. Their eyes shone with the same mix of fear and admiration I had once felt for my superiors. I returned the salute, and in that moment, I knew that the girl who once sat in a car outside her parents' house crying over being dismissed had grown into the woman those cadets now looked to as proof that respect could be earned even against all odds. My story was not just mine anymore. It was a reminder that no matter how deep the wounds of family rejection cut, healing and honor could be found elsewhere. Blood ties fade, but respect chosen and earned remains. To anyone who has ever built their own family out of loyalty, trust, and love rather than blood, know this: you are not alone. Your voice matters, your story carries weight, and your worth is not defined by those who refused to see you. Share your journey because someone out there needs to hear it and believe that they too can rise.